I will start. Andre, is that all right?
Yeah, it's totally. But Jonathan was going to introduce you, at least formally, and begin. Jonathan.
Well, it's 8 o'clock. I hear. Shall I begin or wait for Jonathan?
Yeah. Here he is. Jonathan. Yeah, please. It's over to you.
I'll very briefly introduce you and sort of set the rules.
The rules,
or at least how I'm planning on maintaining order. To avoid a lot of listening to scraping. So thank you again, Andrew, for joining us today.
Yes.
We've got 72 participants at present, and I'm sure that more people will be filing in. We are recording today's session, but are deciding whether or not to publish it after the fact. So if when the Q&A comes up, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please understand that you may be recorded and published. If you'd rather not be recorded and published, let us know and we can edit you out. Otherwise, I'm quite pleased to introduce Andrew. He's worked for 17 years at Emerson, 9 years at Waldorf teacher training in the University of Stuttgart, and is giving courses, seminars, and lectures on various aspects of anthroposophy, literature, art history, Parsifal, and Shakespeare in Britain, Europe, Australia, and Asia. Thank you all for having muted yourselves. In order to maintain order, I'm going to prevent unmuting until the Q&A comes up, just so we avoid accidents and those scrapes and accidental conversations. And then when questions and answers come up, we'll invite those. So thank you very much and enjoy the session. Off to you, Andrew.
Green light for me.
Yes, please.
Greetings, dear friends. This occasion when we meet together in this virtual and maybe even virtuous way lies between the festivals of Ascension and Pentecost. It says in preparing for the theme this evening, I've been busy with this question of the transition from disciples to apostles for some time. And some of you may already be familiar with some of the thoughts that I'm going to share, because they've also been very much part of the preparation for our Whitsun festival next weekend, when we will look at this theme of disciples and apostles and a new community in the context of Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal epic. So I won't mention Parsifal particularly this evening, but this theme has occupied me for some while now, and I'll try and share the aspects of it that belong to what I hope I may assume is our common interest in and love for anthroposophy. In preparing for this, two individuals particularly somehow announced their presence in my consciousness, and I would like to acknowledge them, and that's Elizabeth and Francis Edmonds. They gave me the opportunity to work at Emerson College for a while, and that really was a chance for me to develop so much of the work that I've then been able to take further and share with others, not just at Emerson, but then on a more worldwide basis. And it is in recognition for the love that we shared for these themes in the context of spiritual science that I would like to acknowledge their participation and their role in the biography that has allowed this evening to be part of my work that I share with you this evening. So I have so much in mind this evening, especially Elizabeth and Francis Edmonds. I would like to begin with a question. Do you recognize the following experience? You read or you have read something that Rudolf Steiner either wrote or gave as a lecture, and as you read it, something within you goes, yes, there is this extraordinary recognition of whatever it is that you currently find yourself thinking and discovering on the page. And the experience is one of I know this is true. I could never have said it, and I can't prove it, but I know it's true. And there's a kind of strange aspect to that experience, because if you know something is true, part of you, the logical positivist part of you, feels that if you know it's true, you ought to be able to prove it. And if you, out of the joy of this recognition, you begin to share this with others, they may say, oh yes, really? How do you know? And that's not a question that you can at least not immediately answer. But it's what lies within such an experience that is actually the core of what I want to share this evening. Yes, I know that's true. I certainly couldn't have said it, and I can't prove it. And yet I affirm that I know it is true. Well, the events of Ascension and Pentecost are probably well known to you all. After the resurrected Christ had been with the disciples for 40 days, he takes them to a place, he blesses them, and then they see that he is taken up from them into the heavens or into a cloud. And for 10 days, they are bereft of the presence of the resurrected one who has been with them for those 40 days since the Easter events. And if you're familiar with Bach's Ascension Oratorium, you may well feel this must have been an extremely sad experience for them, that they were now bereft of the one who had accompanied them. It's interesting that in the Luke Gospel, where this event is also described, we are told the disciples returned to Jerusalem with joy. They come then to Jerusalem, they find themselves of one accord and in one place 10 days later. And there is the sound as of a mighty rushing wind. And that which seems to be like a flame, a cloven flame, tongues of fire come in and alight on the foreheads of each of these 12 disciples, and the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, enters into them, and they're able to speak in many tongues. How should one understand that? My own inclination is not to imagine that suddenly they could speak many languages, much more that they were able to speak in such a way that the many, many people in Jerusalem and 18 different groups, races, cultures, religions, different people, 18 different groups of people are mentioned quite specifically. And I don't think it's a question of these 12 now being able to speak those different languages, but much more that they spoke of the universally human in such a way that irrespective of what culture, background, religion, or race you came from, you could understand what was being said, because what these 12 now said belonged not to any specific culture or tradition or religion. It belonged to that which was recognizable as universally human. And this is the moment when the disciples become apostles. It's sometimes a little bit confusing because many people use the terms disciples and apostles as if they were interchangeable. But for me, it's rather clear that this Pentecost moment, this Whitsun moment, is the moment when these 12 now are able to speak, not because they have been taught, but because they recognize that the source for what they want to say lives within them. And they are now able to speak out of a source that they recognize burns with a flame within them, and no longer because they have been told this by their master, by Jesus or by Jesus Christ. And the question is that transition from being a disciple to being an apostle just of historical interest of 2000 years ago? Or is that transition something that has a relevance for us today? Well, let's go back a bit. How do we know about Christ? Certainly, we know a lot from the Gospels. We have heard a lot from what has been said in churches and in many other theological contexts. We know about Christ also from the immense amount of art that in the last 2000 years has celebrated and made visible and made audible so much that belongs to the development of the life of Jesus Christ and the whole Christian cultural tradition that has grown out of that. So there is no shortage of opportunity to become acquainted with the life of Jesus Christ and what he did and what he said in our culture. And of course, that culture extends now on a global basis, even to people and to places where Christianity may not be the religion. When we occupy ourselves a little bit with spiritual science, we're invited to recognize the following: that all the parables and sermons and the most extraordinarily profound farewell discourses in the John Gospel, all these, for all their magnificence, profundity, and inspiring qualities, all these are not what makes the life and work of Christ, the incarnation, of its greatest significance. The significance of the fact that the Son being left the Son, incarnated into the human being Jesus of Nazareth for 3 years, and then experienced what it is for human beings to die, overcame that death and rose on the 3rd day. The significance for world culture lies not in what the Gospels tell us that Jesus Christ said, but in the fact that his deed on Golgotha, an event that historically took place 2000 years ago, that this deed is of immense significance then, now, and even more into the future for the whole of mankind, for the whole of humanity. Spiritual science invites us to recognize that it is what Christ did and not what he said that gives the events of his life its greatest significance. This is maybe quite a challenge for people who are used to regarding the Bible as the source of their connection to Christ. And it may well be that it is the source at a certain stage in one's biography, and one is immeasurably grateful to be able to read about these events and feel the connection is affirmed and strengthened through what we read in the Bible. But if it is true, as Rudolf Steiner again and again invites us to recognize, if it is true that the mystery of Golgotha was for the whole of humanity and not just for those who in one incarnation may think of themselves as Christian, then it is also true that the redemptive power of the mystery of Golgotha, the redemptive forces that flow from that deed of Christ's, are there and available for the whole of humanity. So Bibles, theological studies, and churches have all played their part and still do play a vital part for so many people in their discovering their connection with this turning point of time. That the Bible and the great art is not the source of the redeeming forces of the turning point of time. And I emphasize this turning point of time because it becomes a paradigm that is very relevant for me. You know, if somebody has done you wrong and you wish to forgive them, or if you have done wrong and you wish to ask to be forgiven, if you find a human being in some kind of need and you can make a selfless gesture to help another human being, if at the end of the day you look back and think, tomorrow will be different, or on an even greater scale, a recognition that the future does not have to be a remorseless continuation of what has been the past. Any of these moments can be turning points in our biography, maybe small, maybe not noticed by so many other people, but nevertheless inextinguishably powerful experiences of, from now on, something different is going to take place. Something, I will take the responsibility for a change. And we may make that resolve and we may fail. And we may make that resolve again and we may fail again. The immediately visible success of such a resolve is not significant. What is significant is the experience, I can do things differently. And these individual biographical experiences of a turning point have their now I struggle for a word, their authenticity, they have their source, they have their truth in the reality of the great macrocosmic human earthly turning point that Rudolf Steiner calls the mystery of Golgotha. And because that's true, and because these turning points in our biography are available for anybody of any religion, or indeed for people who profess to have no religion, for atheists, for absolute materialists. These moments of change, these watershed moments in our lives are, for me, without a shadow of doubt, significant, because at such moments, the Christ is present, whether he is recognized as such, whether he is known by name or not. Whether or not we meet the Christ in one incarnation or another is very much of an individual biographical question. Whether or not we meet and recognize the Son being and the consequences of the Son being's sacrifice for the whole of humanity. Whether we recognize that and how we recognize that is not of immediate significance. What is significant is that these are events that attest to the truth of what Rudolf Steiner said when he described the mystery of Golgotha as an event for the whole of humanity. And that then leads to the sometimes painful conclusion for some people that even if we had no Bibles, the redemptive forces of the mystery of Golgotha, the redemptive forces of the original Easter event, shine and pulse through the whole of humanity and are available to all those who, with goodwill and honesty for such questions as who am I, what is the meaning of my life, what is the significance of the people around me and my destiny encounters, such moments are imbued with the redeeming forces from the mystery of Golgotha, whether or not we immediately recognize that source. And in this context, it occurs to me just briefly to mention an interesting polarity, the polarity between the early Celtic church and the church which then became the Roman church. So you will well know that the Celtic church was experienced the reality of the Son being leaving the sun and connecting his destiny with humanity on earth, not because messages came to Ireland and the other western fringes of Europe, not because messengers came announcing the events in the Holy Land. The initiates in these western fringes of Europe who brought over the traditions of the ancient Atlantean mystery schools, perceived directly the spiritual consequences of this momentous turning point in human evolution. And so the whole of their understanding of the significance of that was not based on any records that had been written and then read. It was based on a direct spiritual experience, which was then described as such to succeeding generations. On the other hand, what then became the Roman Church was based very much on the Gospels, on what the evangelists had written, on what other witnesses who'd been present wrote and described had happened. And there's a tremendous polarity and even a painful conflict then later in Europe between these two approaches to the mystery of Golgotha: a direct spiritual experience of the event, or reliance for it on worldly witnesses, on worldly testaments, on written records. And we know how this worked out. The Roman Church was victorious in this struggle, and the Celtic Church was not extinguished. It was suppressed and for a while remained and worked and lived invisibly. It would be then another story to discuss and describe how it continued to live and then became visible in the ensuing centuries in different ways. But the question is now, what does all that mean for us? Let us look at Rudolf Steiner's life and work with this question in mind. Rudolf Steiner was a human being, and he was fallible. He never claimed to know everything. His spiritual perception grew and expanded. He was not given total enlightenment, and he did not offer total enlightenment. He shared the research reports of his spiritual scientific investigations. He walked an inner path out of his own inner forces. And he described that path. And he described that path in a way that actually is an invitation for whoever feels moved to take that path as well, can experience that Rudolf Steiner is a companion who has walked this path and who describes the path and invites those who are interested to walk with him. And in that experience, we can recognize that Rudolf Steiner wakes us up to our own potential. And this is now maybe the crucial point. It's not so much what he gives us as that he wakes us up to what lies dormant in us and describes how he awoke what was dormant in him in such a way that we may feel inspired to walk a similar path and take up some of the many exercises that he describes, so that what slumbers within us as a potential can also be roused to its full potential in each of our biographies. If you are imagining where this is going, I think you will realize that this is maybe the crucial point. So we are, of course, immeasurably grateful to Rudolf Steiner for his descriptions of cosmic, human, earthly evolution, the great panorama of our human evolution in terms of planets and cosmos, and also what that means on an individual biographical basis, the planetary phases in our lives, the significance of the 7-year rhythms in biography work, in pedagogy. We're immensely grateful to Rudolf Steiner for the way in which he brings the understanding of reincarnation and karma into a modern Christian context. His descriptions of the inner path constitute an inestimably precious guide for our own walking of that path. In the context of this, the theme that we're busy with now, we can recognize that what is sometimes known as anthroposophical Christology is a wonderfully broadening and deepening opportunity to study what we read in the Gospels in a context that brings entirely new levels of understanding to what otherwise in the Gospels is something that remains in its beauty. Somehow one could say incomplete when one reads the fifth Gospel and the other lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave on the Gospels. And of course, his understanding of the mystery of Golgotha permeates the whole of his work, not just the lectures that are dedicated to the Gospels. And we recognize also that what Rudolf Steiner gave as impulses for renewal and development in the various professions is of inestimable precious value to doctors, to teachers, to farmers. The way he inspires that all these different professional, social, and personal aspects of life can be enriched and deepened is something for which we are profoundly and inestimably grateful. And this is where I want to connect with the opening question that I shared, namely, what happens, what does it mean when we have this experience of, yes, I know that's true, I couldn't have said it, and I can't prove it. And I think that this now also becomes crucial for our theme here. If we recognize that experience, then it seems to me what is happening is this: we read something that the initiate, Rudolf Steiner, was able to see and describe, and it awakens in us something of that reality that we have already within us. We recognize what we read as resonating with something within us that already has a connection with the content of Rudolf Steiner's investigations and descriptions. So where does that come from? And I'm sure there is more than one answer to that question, but the immediately obvious answer for me is that in the Karma lectures, Rudolf Steiner describes the supersensible school of Michael. And in the Karma lectures, he also invites us to recognize where we in our own biography recognize our participation in all the earthly and supersensible events that lead to our becoming members of the Anthroposophical Society or recognizing a connection with spiritual science. And it will not be new for you, I'm sure, if I say that what Rudolf Steiner brought as anthroposophy, as spiritual science, into public culture in a human earthly language in the 20th century was actually in many ways and in many forms so much of the content of what had been the content of the supersensible school of Michael. And if we have participated more or less intensively at that time in the spiritual world, in these momentous events that prepared for our earthly life now here in the 20th and 21st century, if we participated in that supersensible school of Michael, and I have to say, I also remember with great joy the way Virginia Cease once described this. She described that some of us may have been sitting in the front row, eagerly looking up and taking in everything that was said. Others of us may have been a little bit further back in the great halls, in the great aula of such a school, and maybe not have listened quite so intensively. And then I remember her description that there may have been others who, passing by outside, looked in and thought, that's interesting, and caught maybe a snatch of what was going on under the guidance and the teaching of Michael. I'm so grateful to Virginia that she described this mighty super sensible event in terms that we can immediately relate to in our earthly experience. So if we were part of that super sensible school of Michael, in whatever way our destiny then allowed us to be, if we were part of that, then something of what we now recognize as spiritual science became part of us at that time before this incarnation. And so that we have brought with us, and of course it is the nature of what we bring with us from the spiritual world before birth, that we forget it, and then have to trust that destiny will allow us to remember it as is appropriate in our life. So the contention that I'm endeavoring to express now is that these moments of recognition and resonance, yes, I know that's true, and I can't yet prove it. The contention, the experience of, yes, I know that is true, is the waking up in us of something that we brought with us from our time when we were maybe together in that great super sensible school of Michael, where everything that we now recognize as anthroposophy on earth was part of the great experience that we had in preparing for this and other incarnations. And Rudolf Steiner's research brought him to a very particular, not just understanding, but also experience, which he describes in his unfinished autobiography. Difficult to find the right words for it, but maybe one can say Rudolf Steiner's whole engagement with the question of what is the human being brought him to the understanding that at the turning point of time, the Son being incarnating into the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, and going through those Easter events, and then the Ascension, and then Pentecost, and it's not yet finished, that the whole of that cosmic, human, earthly drama actually represents the archetype for us of what we may one day become. That Christ has become the archetypal human being that we might one day become. And belonging to that is also the understanding that Christ is the great brother of humanity, and that he shows us what we can become. We may experience that in moments on earth, and we may experience that also in the journey between death and rebirth, when immediately after dying, and then again in the sun sphere, and then again in the cosmic midnight hour, we have an encounter with the being who shows us what we are not yet and what we may become. And if this great archetypal paradigm of Christ really belongs to our human becoming, then we can also say that the significant aspect of Rudolf Steiner's life, the singular aspect of Rudolf Steiner's life, was not what he said or what he wrote, but actually what he did. To make this clearer, I would like to describe three aspects of Rudolf Steiner's life that constitute for me the deed, or the deeds we can say, that gave his life the significance beyond anything that we may read of what he said or wrote. And these three events, these three deeds of his biography will not be a surprise for you, but it's important for me to characterize them in this way. The first is that at the Christmas Foundation Conference in 1923-24, he refounded the Anthroposophical Society and himself became a member and connected his destiny with those members who recognized their destiny connection with Rudolf Steiner and with what he brought. But there's another aspect to this, because connecting his destiny with the members and the refounding of the Anthroposophical Society was a deed that brought that spiritual destiny reality into a legal, earthly form in the material world. And it was the first time in the history of our human evolution that such an incarnation absolutely into the world of worldly matters, that a spiritual school took that step. The second of these three deeds that I'd like to describe is concerned with the initiation that Rudolf Steiner experienced. Rudolf Steiner was not initiated by a higher being on earth. It was not that a hierophant initiated him. He describes how at an early stage in his life, he was reminded of who he was and encouraged to become what it was his destiny to become. The master who awoke that potential in him, or rather who awoke him to that potential in him, did precisely that. And the initiation that Rudolf Steiner then experienced was a process that he took full responsibility for himself, out of his own forces, out of the forces that he brought with him, of course, from previous incarnations, but the forces that he brought with him were the basis out of which he himself, on this inner path, discovered and developed the capacity of clairvoyance to research the spiritual world. I'm sorry, I've made rather much of this point. One could simply say that he experienced self-initiation by his own efforts. And that's also a very modern condition, because the whole tenor of his life and his descriptions of the inner path make it clear that that is an option that's available to every human being, however much progress she or he may make on that path is an individual biographical question. But the possibility of undertaking one's own journey towards initiation is affirmed by the fact that Rudolf Steiner achieved that in his own life. And the third deed of significance is that he had the ability and the courage to share the results of his spiritual investigation in human language publicly. And all those elements are important. He developed the capacity to see, his clairvoyant capacity. He also had unflinchingly the courage to say what he had seen, knowing full well that he would irritate other occultists who wanted this knowledge of the higher worlds to be retained for those who, retained by those who could then use it actually as a tool of power. And Rudolf Steiner knew that the time of these secrets was over. So his ability to see was matched by his courage to say. And he said it in a human language that ordinary people could understand and he said it publicly. So these three deeds in his life stand as powerful realities that, I hope you will forgive my saying it like this, that go beyond the significance of anything that he then actually said. What he said is, of course, of immense significance for us, but the fact that he could see it and that he said it, there is the significance that I would like to recognize and affirm. And it seems to me that we can take this point, if you're willing to journey with me a little further with this, it seems to me that we can take this point one step further. We can say, if Rudolf Steiner was an initiate in the 20th century who achieved the capacities that I've described and was able to penetrate into the spiritual worlds in the way that I've described, then the effect of his having done that has consequences for everybody else who then embarks on the journey of self-knowledge with goodwill and honesty for the question, who am I? How can I know myself? How can I understand my life? How can I understand what happens to me? How can I know who I am? If any human being on earth embarks with goodwill and a love for the truth, embarks on the journey beginning with those questions, so much of the spiritual world will begin to reveal itself to whoever undertakes that journey. How far they get will be a question of individual disposition, strength, biography, potential, and whatever. But I want to affirm that Rudolf Steiner's pioneering deed in making the spiritual world available on the basis that hitherto we had only assumed natural science was capable of doing, namely objectively knowing the experiences we have. And Rudolf Steiner's three deeds, or the three aspects of his deeds, have that pioneering quality that makes it possible to say that even if one has never come across Rudolf Steiner, has never read his work, the consequence of his pioneering spiritual deed means that that gateway, that doorway to the spiritual world has now been opened in a way that can be found by sincere seekers for the spirit, wherever they are, whatever their culture, whatever their religion, even if they have no religion, and they begin with such questions out of the wish to know the meaning of their life. This is maybe not an easy thought for some people. And I offer it with all the obvious realities that this is an unfinished thought in me. I'm struggling with this. You can hear me also struggling how to say it in the right way. But it seems to me that this is immensely relevant to the question of whether or not the dynamic, the polarity, the transition between disciple and apostle that we read about that took place 2000 years ago for those 12, whether that has any relevance for us today in the work that we do out of anthroposophy and out of spiritual science. Maybe I can put that question in different ways. When does our gratitude to Rudolf Steiner for what he revealed to us change to gratitude for showing us our own relationship to what he described? Or when does the gratitude to the teacher for the treasure of the content become gratitude to the teacher for awakening me to my own destiny with that content? I would like to say that again. When does my gratitude to the teacher for the treasure of the content become gratitude to the teacher for awakening me to my own destiny with that content? For the disciples, Pentecost was a watershed. Everything was different after that moment. The terms disciples and apostles don't really seem appropriate for us today. We wouldn't think of ourselves as disciples of Rudolf Steiner or apostles for anthroposophy. The terms just don't seem to fit quite rightly. But when do we wake up to the awesome reality that we can also begin to think and speak out of the flame that burns within us? And that is in no way to diminish the gratitude for Rudolf Steiner or the significance of him, his work, and what he has given us. I think it is the greatest recognition of Rudolf Steiner's life and work that we do not lean on him. He encourages us to find our own feet. He accompanies and also guides our steps. And the blessing of his presence is to make us free, free to find our own relationship, as he did, to what we recognize is also ours from having encountered it again now on earth through his work. And this becoming free is not an instant watershed moment. It's not that suddenly we no longer feel that we are in a learning situation. Of course not. It's a gradual and slow process. Discipleship and apostleship overlap. We are in both maybe a lot of the time. The inestimable gratitude that we feel to Rudolf Steiner is an inner gesture that we must never be shy of acknowledging outwardly. Never be embarrassed or afraid to refer to him by name. Never be afraid that this may expose us to ridicule. But that acknowledgement and gratitude to Rudolf Steiner does not become a reason to quote what he said as the authority for what we say. It's so interesting. Sometimes we say quite carelessly, we know from Rudolf Steiner, and then we quote something. I wonder if we can know anything because somebody else knew it. I suspect that we're grateful to be reminded of it, but whether we know it or not depends on the activity that we engage in to make it our own. We have Bibles, so let's read them and deepen our understanding. But the Bible is not the source of our connection to Christ. We have the books and the written transcripts of the lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave. Let us read them and continue to learn and deepen our spiritual strivings. But let us not imagine that the written and the spoken works of Rudolf Steiner is the source of our connection to anthroposophy. It may well be the means by which we wake up to it and can develop it and understand it more. But the source of our connection to anthroposophy is something that lies within us individually. I know this may not be an easily acceptable idea for some people, and I hope it is clear from the way I'm saying all this that it is not in the least to disrespect or to diminish the significance of Rudolf Steiner. I think actually quite the contrary, because I have a sense also that we burden him and we lame ourselves if we remain dependent on what he said and wrote. So we are exploring these thoughts now in connection with Whitsun, and Whitsun is an opportunity for a new community. If we look around in the world today, we see that the paradigms and structures from the past simply do not serve us anymore, and they will not serve us in any future that we could be pleased to be part of. In politics, economics, commerce, academia, pedagogy, society, domestic and interpersonal relationships, in question of identity, all the norms that we have inherited are longing to be re-evaluated, maybe replaced, maybe strengthened in new ways. Some weeks ago, when I explored with you the theme of what lies beyond tolerance, I suggested that in the social art, the seventh art that belongs to the future, we may manage to evolve structures and paradigms and interrelational dynamics and norms that give the possibility of our humanity developing in completely different ways. And what is generally known in anthroposophy as threefolding has already given rise to a number of initiatives which are courageous and situationally sensitive. I think we're also familiar with the struggles that this threefolding encounters. Sometimes it's approached a little bit dogmatically, sometimes it's approached very experimentally. Of course, we haven't got it right yet, but that's a direction in which we can begin, even in small, situationally appropriate ways, creatively, to try to bring about a way of relating to each other that corresponds to the paradigm that lives in that threefolding. Well, I think it's probably not a surprise if I say I recognize within myself there is still very much a disciple, still very much someone who is grateful to be able to turn to a text for a quotation or for an affirmation, for elucidation. Of course, I recognize that grateful, I hesitate to use the word dependence, but it seems not to be the wrong word. I'm grateful for the opportunity to find in the work of Rudolf Steiner something that helps me and enables me to take my inner work and my life further. But together with that, I also recognize that in that process, something in me awakens that I dare to be able to call my own. So if Pentecost, if Whitsun has to do with the new community, and if we recognize that so much of what community life has been so far in the world is inadequate, how do we face the anthroposophical society? Nationally and at the Goetheanum, we can see how inevitably inadequate we all are in that new structure, how inevitably inadequate the workings and the personalities and the struggles, how we are still struggling to find the right way. But it's important to recognize that the challenges and the appearance of inadequacy in connection with the anthroposophical society is not because it is something that was once perfect and has now become broken or worn out. Not at all. It is because the potential of the anthroposophical society has not yet been achieved. All the challenges, frustrations, and disappointments that we may recognize as ours and as those that belong to our companions within the society come from the fact that we are struggling to find the right way into the future. So the Whitsun challenge for our community is not to repair or renew the anthroposophical society, but rather to work that it become what it has not yet achieved. It is the new community, and it's waiting for what we bring to it to enable it to realize its potential. Celts and Romans, shepherds and kings, heretics and pagans, sisters and brothers all, in the spirit of Rudolf Steiner's selfless karmic deeds for us, and in the spirit of Christ's selfless deed for humanity, the goodwill and courage for working together, even though we might not agree, working together, even though we might not always like each other, but the goodwill for what we can do together, despite the differences, the intuitive and freely given yes to our chosen destiny. That is the manifestation of the Holy Spirit today. And that will serve the coming to fruition and the true meaning of Rudolf Steiner's seminal Whitsun deed in incarnating on earth the spiritual community we resolved to be part of when we participated in the Supersensible School of Michael. When we work together, we make real the most essential impulse in Rudolf Steiner's life and work. That is the way to honor and acknowledge the significance of Rudolf Steiner's life and work, the intention that lives in the Christmas Foundation deed, and in sharing the content of the Karma lectures in a new community on earth. As I have already said, fully incarnated into the material, legal, and economic realities of this earthly dimension that Christ also incarnated into, so that this new spiritual community on earth can be the bearer and the guardian of what we learned in the Supersensible School of Michael, now in the new form that came through Rudolf Steiner as the School of Spiritual Science. Of course, we will continue to learn from what Rudolf Steiner shared with us, but in what we do, we rightly aspire to be sisters and brothers with him and acknowledge him. If we see him as our brother, and in that recognize Christ as the great brother of the whole of humanity, then despite all our incompletenesses, imperfections, and still unredeemed aspects, then the inextinguishable flame that burns, warms our hearts, and illumines our heads is the individual manifestation of the Holy Spirit that we bring to the new communities we create. The global crisis on every level so easily seduces us on the one hand to yearn for the outdated structures and norms of the past, which we seem to have lost, and on the other hand, induces us out of fear to comply with new norms that we certainly have not chosen. Our future depends on trusting our individual capacity to discern what is true and to recognize the companions we work with. That is the Whitsun reality today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, I've allowed everyone to unmute themselves. If there are questions or comments.
Hello, Andrew, you're shaking.
I am so thrilled with what you brought, because it's not only timely in that we often see statements, but there's another item here. When you brought up paradigms from the past, it calls for this pondering of Paul and Peter. There's a lot of alliterations on P. And how even after Peter had become the Apostle Peter, Paul could still correct him. And this was because Peter still carried these paradigms of the past.
Beautiful. So even then.
Even then.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much, Andrew.
And it's such an inspiration, you know, what you said about it was never perfect. It's never going to be perfect on earth. No matter what we bring from the spiritual world, it will not be perfect on the earth. And then to complain about the imperfections is sort of silly, because we are doomed to have the imperfections. It's a constant ongoing work. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. Yes, Yaya, please. I can't see everybody, so just begin to speak. Yes, Yaya.
Right. I just wanted to share with you something that is relevant to your talk tonight. One of the books that I'm reading is the Chronicles of the Crypt Monasteries in Kiev, written in about the year 1000 to 1010. And one sentence that seems to quote a gospel somewhere is Christ saying to the disciples, what I said in darkness, you must now bring into light.
Beautiful.
And that is the change between being a disciple and between becoming an apostle, I find. And Christ himself brought things out of the darkness. Rudolf Steiner certainly, historically, has brought all the occult esoteric schools into the open, into the public domain. And when you said he helps us to find our feet, I want to say one more thing. He is also helping us to find our voice.
Yes.
Which means once we are grounded enough and have read as much as we have been able to and hopefully understood something, unless we metabolized internally to make it ours, then our voice is not going to be a true voice. But we have been given the possibility not just of finding our voice, but of using our voice. And this is the Pentecost for me, when we learn to communicate at a human level to whoever happens to meet us on the path that we share.
Thank you, Yaya. Thank you.
But yeah.
Yes, and I say it ultimately comes down to how we live. And then if you say I'm living, and it's through your actions, through your deeds, then if you say, well, you know, I got this information or started it with Rudolf Steiner from such and such, and that was my inspiration, then that can go on. But if you're just quoting Steiner, this and that and the other thing, and you say, well, if I market it better, if I make a different title to the book, then it will sell. That won't work.
Thank you, Dick. Well, maybe that's it. Yes, please, Sarah.
Hi, yeah. Maybe this is a bit radical, but I don't really understand why you feel that him stepping the anthroposophic society into a legal framework, why that was so important in the context of particularly the questions or the statements that others tonight have just brought forward, and really what I feel is the core of what you've shared. I am just rebelling against that feeling.
Oh, good. I love rebels.
So I thought I must say, I
don't know whether I can, yes, I don't know whether I can answer your question, but I certainly feel I may try and say something.
Please.
So if we think of the significance of the incarnation of Christ, I don't know whether it was ever a question for you, but it was certainly a question for me. Why was it necessary for Christ to incarnate onto the earth? Wouldn't it have been possible for God or the hierarchies simply to breathe goodness into the world so that what had begun to be going wrong could then be corrected just out of the benevolent, good spiritual forces that could emanate from the Godhead? Why was it necessary for the Son of God to incarnate? And then we have the two Jesus children, and what happened at 12, and then what happened at 18. It's all terribly complicated. Was it really necessary? Couldn't God have made things better simply through his divine potency? I don't know whether anybody else ever had that question, but I'm very grateful that I had that question, because struggling with that question brought me to understand that once, now I'm going to put it in very profane terms, once God had started this whole drama, this game of humanity, he then had to play by the rules. And therefore, if things were going to change, they had to change on the terms that things had already become. You couldn't bring something from outside. You had to bring about a change within the terms of what had already been begun. And because it was as a result of our entanglement with matter, the fall we normally understand as a moral failing, disobedience. It's so refreshing the way Rudolf Steiner describes it in occult science. There's no guilt attached to the fall. The fall simply means we fell into matter. The church likes to portray this as the sin, the original sin and our disobedience. It was simply a necessary step so that becoming involved in the material world, becoming involved in the earthly substance, falling into matter would give us the possibility of becoming free in another way. If we'd stayed in paradise, we would have been good out of obedience, but never free. So in order to become free, we had to take the risk of error. And that involved entanglement with matter. And so the redemptive deed of the Son being could not be accomplished from the Son. It had to be accomplished by entering into the world where human beings had begun to experience the risk of getting it wrong. And if we understand the incarnation as necessary from that point of view, then for me, the paradigm, the parallel is very clear. Rudolf Steiner's deed of connecting his destiny with the destiny of those people who recognized what he was doing, not simply at the level of a spiritual recognition, but also at the level of recognizing their membership of an earthly incarnated, and I say legal, you could say fiscal, you could say an organization that had to pay rent, that had to pay an electricity bill, that had to take out an insurance policy, that was responsible for the health and safety of people as they came into the buildings. All this entanglement with matter was a necessary step in a process so that we could become free of that. And therefore, Rudolf Steiner's relationship to the Anthroposophical Society that was founded in 1912 and 1913 had a very different character. He remained the occult teacher who did not become a member. And when things began to go wrong, he realized that, and I want to put it in this way, the paradigm, the great example of Christ's unequivocal step into the world of matter was also what then allowed him to find that step as the necessary one. And what is so beautiful about this aspect of Rudolf Steiner's biography is that he had to do it one way to later know that it now had to be done another way. You can see I'm hesitating to say he had to get it wrong in order to get it right. But in a way, that's also not the wrong way of saying it. And this is another wonderful example of Rudolf Steiner not being totally enlightened, but having to find his way each step. And his first relationship to the Anthroposophical Society proved not to be, how shall we say this? His relationship to the Anthroposophical Society that he founded in 1912 and 1913 was not enough. And then in 1923-24, he realized that a further step an entanglement with the world was an inevitable next step for the world itself to be involved and then potentially changed. Sarah, you can't imagine how grateful I am to you for your rebellious question, because I think that belongs so much to our theme this evening. Thank you. I don't know whether that helps.
Yeah, it's really lovely to hear you speak really sincerely in your journey to answer me. And I feel that I feel pleased that I can accept what you're offering in the context of knowing that in feeling what you've said, that I can accept that, because I know for myself the need that I feel for us to continue to seriously journey, you know, the legal or fiscal or etc., often extremely corrupt processes. And it was that bit that I was struggling with, but
Yes, so Rudolf Steiner's involvement in the law and the fiscal things was not because he necessarily approved of them, but because he realized that only by fully engaging in the matters of this world would the redemptive possibility of his work be possible. Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Oh, have you got time for another question, Andrew?
Yes, Sally. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
No, okay. Well, just as you know, as reading over the years, you know, as just as an interested member, you read the history that's written about, you know, the Anthroposophical Society, and very often I've picked up a feeling that people thought that Steiner's, you know, move to become a member and so on was in some way a sort of tragedy, and that, you know, people sort of giving you the feeling, oh, in the end the members killed him with their endless demands and on all this, and you're left, you know, I'm very surprised by your take on it, because I've always been kind of left feeling, oh dear, you know, it's kind of, you know, that was kind of wrong as well, and it killed him and all that. I'm not putting it very well, but it's, you know, what I was sort of left feeling often. Not that I thought a lot about it, but I wonder what you say about that.
Yes, there's no doubt that that unstinting involvement in the demands of the world, and I want to simply put it in that way, if I may, Sally, that unstinting willingness to be involved in the demands that came from being incarnated in the world, took its toll. But that doesn't mean it was wrong. It doesn't mean it was wrong at all, because anything less would have been unsuccessful. And forgive the paradigm now, but you could say, how silly of Jesus to let himself be crucified. Why didn't he meet the expectations of Judas and proclaim his divine potential and confound the Romans and the Jews? No, the resurrection could only happen if there was a crucifixion, and the crucifixion could only happen if there was, and I'm not going to use the word betrayal, if there was a revelation of his identity through an individual such as Judas. And the same is true for me of Rudolf Steiner, that of course there were many tragedies in his life, but they were tragedies that were necessary from an earthly point of view to lead to a spiritual possibility.
No, it's great the way you've brought it. You know, I'm very happy to have heard it. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, Sally.
May I ask a question?
Yes, I can't see who you are, but I would love. Who are you?
Diana Reynolds. I'm Diana Reynolds.
Yes, hello. I've got you now. Hello, Diana. Yes.
Firstly, thank you so much for what you have said. And what I want to sort of ask is to do with, right at the end, you mentioned the Holy Spirit. And I'm very glad you did mention this, because it's probably a talk on its own, but for me, there's this incredible interweaving with the Sophia being, this connection. And I feel in what you said and how we, out of life experience and so on, what we do and develop, we in turn assist the evolution process for mankind in some small way, maybe. but in also this helping of the connection to the Sophia being and helping the development and evolution of her. Now, does that for me connects directly with this word Holy Spirit? And I would like you to comment.
Dana, I would love to be able to say something wise that does justice to the wisdom of your question, but it's not a theme that I'm so familiar with. But the way you ask the question shows that you have lived with that, and that the connection between the Holy Spirit and the Sophia is certainly something that I recognize. But I cannot say more than yes. Thank you for bringing them into connection.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry if that's disappointing. Yes.
It's okay. It is true. I am researching it, and I find more and more gems from Rudolf Steiner. And this is what inspires me, because on one occasion he actually, in the book, in the translation I have, it says Sophia, comma, the Holy Spirit, and that said so much for me, how these things interweave. And then there was a wonderful thing I then discovered. It's in the book on Isis, Mary, Sophia, lots of compilation, is how the Holy Spirit, the aura is of many colors. Her aura is of many colors. So I leave you with that. Thank you again. You have brought something very special tonight.
Well, just to say that, of course, we have this expression of anthroposophia. So that wisdom of the human being already lives in the whole tenor of spiritual science.
Yeah.
That being. Yes. Thank you, Diana. Maria.
I'm just thinking about something, and I think it's a bit trivial, but I'm going to say it anyway. And it's how out of the situation we have had in the world for the last 12 months or something like that, new communities have come about. So the way we are actually communicating now, these Zoom kind of conversations and the gatherings and so on, is something that is like a new way of meeting.
Yes.
That it most probably will go into the future, right? And there are times that the things that may look like quite negative eventually will have a positive outcome.
Yes, I think that's
and for me,
true.
what we are doing now is a way of Pentecost in some ways. It's a kind of new community, new gathering, new ways of meeting. And I find that is quite inspiring.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that the absence of co-presence in space is so extraordinarily compensated for in co-presence in time. And the fact that all these people, there were 80 people at one stage apparently in this community that we have created now, it means that for all the obvious and unnecessarily repeated disadvantages of this technological medium, for all those obvious disadvantages, we can affirm exactly in the way that you have said. At another level, something of a community arises out of that. The danger would be is if we accepted this substitute as a permanent alternative. But the great thing would be is if life allows us to meet in reality, but not then necessarily stop meeting like this, but to recognize, just as the telephone is also a substitute for real communion, this is also a substitute, and a substitute that we can be grateful for, but should not now accept as an alternative. And one of the great dangers in education at the moment is, not just with children, but at tertiary level in universities, people realize that this form of communion is much cheaper from every point of view. Yes. It's also sold to us as being environmentally much more friendly because no one has to spend any energy in traveling anywhere. So what we will be told in the future is that this form of communion for education and pedagogy is actually going to replace a lot of what otherwise would have been personal encounters in classrooms and tutorials. So I completely agree with what you're saying, but I think at the same time we have to say, let us not be seduced into thinking this is better.
Thank you. And thank you for what you bring, Andrew, and making these connections possible.
Dear Maria, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, dear people, is that a good moment to end? Or is there still someone who would like to say something? Good. Well, in that case, Andre and Jonathan, thank you for organizing this event. Thank you for making it technologically and humanly possible for us to meet in this way. And please accept these unfinished thoughts, these thoughts in progress as a contribution to our coming Whitsun festival. So for me, it's good night. It may be good afternoon for some of you, I don't know, but thank you for participating and giving us the chance to meet virtually and maybe also virtuously, who knows. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Dear Andrew, thank you so much for being a very good friend and colleague, and for all your presentations for Chicago branch and whole English-speaking community, but also world community. Because I saw some people from Russia, and of course, some people from Australia, New Zealand. So thank you so much.
Well, you're a great facilitator of all of this. Dear Andre and Jonathan, your technical expertise makes this all possible. So I'm so grateful for this chance to be with you in this way now. Thank you. And with good thoughts for Whitsun.
Yeah, we're very happy. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andy.
Thank you.